What would you do if your business partner of 30 years suddenly started suggesting you were too old to run the company you built from nothing? Would you gracefully step aside, fight back publicly? Or would you do what I did, let him think his plan was working while you prepared the most devastating counterattack in corporate history? My name is Betty White, and at 60 years old, I've learned that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who smile at you across the boardroom table while planning to steal everything you've worked for. 3 decades ago, when I was a naive 30-year-old with a brilliant idea for a marketing consultancy, I thought business partnerships were built on trust, shared vision, and mutual respect. I was about to discover that for some people, partnerships are just elaborate long cons designed to separate you from your success. The company was called Whitestone Marketing, a name that combined my surname with that of my business partner, Michael Stone. We'd met in graduate school, two ambitious kids with complementary skills and big dreams about changing how businesses connected with their customers. I was the creative visionary with an intuitive understanding of consumer psychology. Michael was the numbers guy with a talent for operations and client management. For the first 10 years, it was a perfect partnership. I developed revolutionary marketing strategies that made our clients millions, while Michael handled the business side with what seemed like genuine competence and integrity. We grew from a 2-person operation working out of my apartment to a 50-employee firm with offices in 3 states and an annual revenue of $12 million. But success, I've learned, has a way of revealing people's true character. And Michael's character, as it turned out, was far darker than I'd ever imagined. The first sign something was wrong came during our 15th year in business. We were reviewing the annual financial reports when I noticed some discrepancies in our client billing records. Nothing obvious, just small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up when I cross-referenced them with the projects I remembered working on. "Michael," I said, pointing to a line item that showed billing for a campaign I'd never heard of. "What's this project for Meridian Industries? I don't recall working on anything for them." His explanation was smooth, practiced. "Oh, that was a small project I handled personally while you were dealing with your mother's estate. Just some basic branding work, nothing that required your creative input." It was a reasonable explanation. My mother had died 6 months earlier, and I'd taken time off to handle her affairs. But something about Michael's response bothered me. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. The slight hesitation before he answered, the defensive edge in his voice. That night, I went back to the office and pulled our complete client files. What I found made my blood run cold. Meridian Industries wasn't a small branding project. It was a major account worth over $300,000 in annual billing. And according to the files, Michael had been managing this relationship for 3 years. 3 years during which I'd never heard the client's name mentioned in any of our meetings. More digging revealed other small projects I'd allegedly been too busy to handle. A website redesign for a tech startup, a full marketing campaign for a regional restaurant chain, a rebranding effort for a nonprofit organization, all of them substantial accounts, all of them managed exclusively by Michael, all of them generating revenue that somehow never appeared in the partnership distributions I received. But here's what really made my hands shake as I read through those files. Every single one of these secret clients had been told that I was the junior partner in our firm, someone who handled creative support, while Michael was the real decision maker and strategic mind behind Whitestone Marketing. Michael had been systematically rewriting the history of our company, positioning himself as the senior partner and me as his assistant. And he'd been doing it for years, right under my nose while I focused on the work I loved and trusted him to handle the business side with integrity. That was the night I realized my business partner wasn't just stealing money from our partnership. He was stealing credit for my work, undermining my reputation with clients, and positioning himself to eventually push me out of the company I'd created. But instead of confronting him immediately, I made a decision that would prove to be the smartest strategic choice of my business career. I decided to let Michael continue his slow-motion coup while I gathered evidence, documented every betrayal, and prepared for the war I now knew was inevitable. The next morning, I walked into our office with a smile and asked Michael how the Meridian Industries project was going. He looked surprised for just a moment, then recovered with that same practiced smoothness. "Oh, it's wrapping up nicely. Nothing you need to worry about." "That's wonderful," I said warmly. "I'd love to see the final materials when you have a chance. It's always interesting to see how different clients respond to various approaches." I watched his face carefully as he agreed to show me the materials sometime soon. The flash of panic in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Michael wasn't just hiding these accounts from me, he was actively afraid of me discovering the full scope of what he'd been doing. Over the next 15 years, yes, 15 years, I conducted the most comprehensive investigation of corporate betrayal you can imagine. I documented every secret client meeting, every private contract, every conversation where Michael positioned himself as the real power behind our company. I hired private investigators to trace financial irregularities. I had forensic accountants analyze our books to identify the money that should have been mine. Most importantly, I started building my own independent relationships with our legitimate shared clients, the ones who knew me as the creative force behind their successful campaigns. I wanted to make sure that when the inevitable showdown came, I wouldn't lose everything I'd worked for. Michael, meanwhile, grew bolder in his attempts to marginalize me. He started scheduling important client meetings when I was out of the office. He began making major strategic decisions without consulting me, then presenting them as accomplished facts. He hired new employees who reported directly to him and barely acknowledged my role in the company. But the most insulting part was how he tried to make me feel like I was imagining the whole thing. Whenever I questioned his decisions or asked for clarification about projects I hadn't been involved in, Michael would give me a condescending smile and suggest that I was being oversensitive or paranoid. "Betty," he'd say in that tone that made my skin crawl, "we're partners. We trust each other. Not every decision needs to be a committee meeting. Trust." The word became a weapon he used against me whenever I got too close to discovering another piece of his deception. He'd invoke our 30-year partnership, our shared history, our mutual success as proof that I was wrong to question his motives. But I wasn't wrong. I was just being very, very patient. By my 60th birthday, I had compiled a file cabinet full of evidence documenting Michael's systematic betrayal of our partnership. I had proof that he'd stolen credit for campaigns worth millions of dollars. I had recordings of phone calls where he told clients that I was the aging creative who needed to step back and let younger minds take over. I even had copies of the incorporation documents he'd secretly filed in Delaware, establishing a new company called Stone Marketing Group. Notice the absence of white in the name, with plans to transfer all of our major clients to his new firm while leaving me with nothing but the office lease and the unpaid bills. Michael thought he was playing a long game, slowly positioning himself to steal everything I'd built. What he didn't realize was that I'd been playing an even longer game, gathering evidence and preparing for the day when his patience ran out and he made his final move. That day came on a Tuesday in March, when Michael walked into my office with a concerned expression and a speech I'd been expecting for years. "Betty, we need to talk about the future of this company." I looked up from the marketing campaign I was developing, one of the most innovative projects of my career, which Michael would never get the chance to steal, and smiled. "Of course, Michael. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time." Michael settled into the chair across from my desk, with the confident air of someone who believed he held all the cards. In his briefcase, I knew, were documents that would formalize my removal from the company I'd created. What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 15 years, and every word he was about to speak would be recorded for posterity. "Betty, I've been thinking a lot about where we are in our careers," he began, using the same fake, concerned tone I'd heard him practice on the phone with clients. "We've built something amazing together, but I think it might be time to consider some changes." I leaned back in my chair, projecting the image of a tired woman ready to hear about her golden years. "What kind of changes, Michael?" "Well, you're 60 now. You've worked incredibly hard for 3 decades. Don't you think you've earned the right to step back and enjoy retirement?" There it was. The opening gambit I'd been expecting. Frame my age as a liability, position retirement as a reward rather than a forced exit. Make it sound like his idea was for my benefit rather than his profit. That's thoughtful of you to consider my well-being, I said carefully. But I love this work. I'm not ready to retire. Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I understand that, and I admire your passion, but we have to be realistic about the future of the company. Our clients are getting younger, their needs are evolving, and they're looking for fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. Fresh perspectives. From the man who'd been riding my creative coattails for 30 years while secretly positioning himself as the genius behind our success. Are you saying our current work isn't innovative? I asked, allowing a note of hurt to creep into my voice. No, of course not. Michael backtracked quickly. Your work has been the foundation of our success, but the marketing industry is changing rapidly. Social media, digital campaigns, emerging platforms. These are areas where younger strategists might have advantages. I almost laughed at the irony. Just 2 months earlier, I developed a groundbreaking social media campaign that generated a 400% increase in engagement for one of our major clients. Michael had presented that campaign to the client as his own work, naturally. I suppose you have a point, I said, playing the role he expected. The technology side of things can be overwhelming sometimes. Michael's eyes lit up with what he probably thought was sympathy. Exactly. And that's why I think this could be the perfect time for you to transition to a consulting role. You'd still be involved with the company, still contributing your expertise, but without the day-to-day pressure of running operations. A consulting role. Translation, a figurehead position with no real authority, no access to financial records, and probably no guaranteed income. A way to keep me quiet while he completed his takeover. What would that look like practically? I asked. Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. I've had our lawyers draw up some preliminary agreements that outline how this transition could work. Our lawyers. Another lie. These documents bore the letterhead of Harrison, Mackenzie & Associates, a firm I'd never heard of. Our actual legal representation came from Patricia Chen at Chen & Partners, a woman who'd been handling our contracts for over a decade and who definitely would have mentioned if Michael had asked her to draft retirement paperwork for me. This is very detailed, I said, flipping through the documents without really reading them. I'd have plenty of time to analyze every clause later, in the privacy of my home, with the help of the real lawyers I'd been consulting for the past 5 years. I wanted to make sure we covered everything properly, Michael said. The transition needs to be smooth for the sake of our employees and our clients. Our employees who'd been gradually shifted to report directly to him. Our clients who'd been told I was stepping back from active involvement in their accounts. Michael had been orchestrating this transition for years. These documents were just the legal formalization of a coup that was already well underway. I appreciate how much thought you've put into this, I said, but this is a big decision. I'd need some time to review everything carefully. Michael's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the flash of impatience underneath. Of course, take all the time you need, but I think it would be good if we could finalize everything within the next few weeks. There are some client situations that would benefit from clarity about our leadership structure. Client situations. More likely, Michael had been making promises to steal our accounts that he couldn't fulfill while I remained a full partner with legal rights to those relationships. What kind of client situations? I asked innocently. Oh, nothing urgent, Michael said, recovering his composure. Just some strategic planning discussions that would be easier to navigate with a clear decision-making hierarchy. Decision-making hierarchy. The man who'd spent 30 years benefiting from my creative genius was now positioning himself as my superior in the company I'd founded. I understand, I said. Let me take these documents home and read through everything carefully. We can schedule another meeting next week to discuss my thoughts. That sounds perfect, Michael said, standing up with visible relief. He'd expected more resistance, more emotional reaction, more of the paranoid behavior he'd been using to gaslight me for years. As he headed for the door, He turned back with what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "Betty, I want you to know that this isn't about your value to the company or your contributions over the years. You've been an incredible partner, and I respect everything you've built here." Past tense. He was already talking about my contributions in past tense, as if my career was something that had already ended. "Thank you, Michael. That means a lot." After he left, I sat in my office for several minutes, staring at the folder full of documents that were designed to steal my life's work. Then I reached into my desk drawer and turned off the digital recording device I'd been using to capture our conversation. 15 years of preparation were about to pay off. Michael thought he was finally ready to make his move, but he had no idea what he was really up against. That evening, I spread Michael's fake retirement documents across my dining room table and began the most satisfying analysis of my career. Every clause, every provision, every carefully worded section designed to separate me from my company and my income. The consulting agreement was particularly insulting. It offered me a generous stipend of $5,000 per month in exchange for my occasional strategic input on projects that Michael would select at his discretion. Meanwhile, the company I'd built generated over $1 million in monthly revenue, and my creative work was responsible for at least 70%. But the most revealing document was the partnership dissolution agreement, which detailed how our assets would be divided when I voluntarily stepped down. Michael would retain control of all client relationships, all intellectual property, all business equipment, and the company name. I would receive a one-time payment of $200,000, less than what some of our major clients paid us for a single campaign. It was the kind of deal that would leave me financially comfortable enough not to make waves, but not wealthy enough to compete with Michael's new venture. He'd calculated exactly how much money it would take to buy my silence and my exit from the industry I'd helped shape. What Michael hadn't calculated was that I'd spent 15 years documenting every dollar he'd stolen, every client he'd lied to, and every law he'd broken in his attempt to erase my contribution to our success. As I read through his documents, I was mentally comparing them to the evidence files I'd been compiling in my home office. Bank records showing Michael's secret payments from clients who thought they were working exclusively with him. Email correspondences where he explicitly told potential clients that I was the creative support, while he was the strategic lead. Recorded phone calls where he discussed plans to transition Betty out with people he thought were his allies. By midnight, I had a complete understanding of Michael's strategy and a detailed plan for my response. He'd given me 1 week to review his documents and make my decision. I was going to use that week to prepare the most comprehensive corporate takedown in the history of our industry. The next morning, I called Patricia Chen, our real lawyer, and asked her to clear her schedule for an emergency consultation. "Patricia, I need to discuss some partnership issues that have recently come to my attention. And I think you should know that I have reason to believe Michael has been operating outside our partnership agreement for quite some time." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Patricia's office with 15 years worth of evidence spread across her conference table. Her expression grew more serious with each document I showed her. "Betty," she said finally, "this isn't just a partnership dispute. What you're describing could constitute fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Michael could be facing criminal charges." "I know," I replied, "and I want to make sure we handle this properly, not just to protect my interests, but to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." That afternoon, I called Michael and scheduled our follow-up meeting for the following Tuesday. 7 days to put together the most devastating presentation of his career. "Perfect timing," Michael said when I told him I'd be ready to discuss his proposal. "I think you're going to find that retirement suits you beautifully." "Oh, Michael," I said, smiling as I looked at the evidence files covering my kitchen table. "I think this meeting is going to be full of surprises." Tuesday morning arrived gray and rainy, the kind of Seattle weather that makes you want to stay inside with a hot cup of coffee and a good book. But I'd been looking forward to this day for 15 years, and no amount of bad weather was going to dampen my spirits. I arrived at our office at 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before our scheduled meeting. I wanted to make sure everything was prepared perfectly for what would either be Michael's confession, an apology, or the most satisfying confrontation of my professional life. In our main conference room, I arranged my materials with the precision of a military strategist. At the head of the table, where Michael typically sat during client presentations, I placed a single manila folder containing his fake retirement documents. Around the table, I positioned 15 banker's boxes, each one labeled with a year from our partnership and filled with evidence of his systematic betrayal. The centerpiece of my display was a professional easel, holding a poster-sized chart that I'd had made at a local print shop. It showed Whitestone Marketing's annual revenue over 30 years, with my creative campaigns highlighted in blue and Michael's legitimate contributions highlighted in green. The chart made it visually obvious that my work had generated approximately 85% of our company's income, while Michael's secret side deals highlighted in red had diverted millions of dollars away from our partnership. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Michael walked into the conference room, carrying a single briefcase and wearing the confident smile of someone who believed victory was at hand. His expression changed dramatically when he saw my elaborate setup. "Betty, what's all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the boxes and charts surrounding the conference table. "This," I said, settling into my chair at the opposite end of the table, "is 30 years of our partnership, properly documented and analyzed. I thought it would be helpful to review our history together before we discuss the future." Michael's confident demeanor was already beginning to crack. "I'm not sure we need to go through old records. We both know what we've accomplished together." "Do we?" I asked, opening the first banker's box and pulling out a file labeled Mariner Industries, years 1-3. "For example, Michael, do we both know about your work with Meridian Industries?" The color drained from his face as I set the file in front of him. "Betty, I can explain." "Oh, please do," I interrupted. "Explain how you managed a $300,000 annual account for 3 years while telling me it was just a small branding project you handled during my mother's funeral." Michael stared at the file without opening it. "It started as a small project. It just grew over time. It grew because you told the client that I was your junior partner, someone who provided creative support while you were the real strategic mind behind our company." I pulled out a second file. "Just like you told Cascade Technologies that I was stepping back from active client management due to my age." "Betty, you're taking these conversations out of context." "Am I?" I reached into another box and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Because I have the actual conversations, Michael. Recorded phone calls where you systematically undermined my reputation with clients while positioning yourself as my superior." I pressed play on the recorder, and Michael's voice filled the conference room. "Betty's been great over the years, but she's getting to that age where she's not as sharp as she used to be. I've been handling more of the strategic work lately while she focuses on the creative side." Michael was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Those were private conversations about our joint clients, discussing partnership business that directly affected my income and reputation." I turned off the recorder and set it aside. "Would you like to hear more? I have hours of material." For the next 30 minutes, I walked Michael through 15 years of documented betrayal. Bank records showing clients who'd been paying him directly instead of through our partnership accounts. Email correspondence where he'd positioned himself as the CEO while referring to me as a consultant. Meeting notes where he'd discussed plans to transition Betty out of the company with people he thought were his allies. But the most damaging evidence was the secret incorporation documents I'd discovered for Stone Marketing Group, the company he'd been planning to use to steal all of our clients while leaving me with nothing but debt. "This is particularly interesting," I said, sliding the incorporation papers across the table. "Stone Marketing Group, incorporated in Delaware 6 months ago, with you listed as the sole owner and president. The business plan explicitly mentions acquiring clients from Whitestone Marketing as part of a strategic transition away from aging leadership." Michael couldn't even look at the documents. "Betty, I know how this looks, but it looks like embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty," I said calmly, "which is exactly what it is." I reached into the final box and pulled out a leather portfolio that contained the crown jewel of my investigation, a key financial analysis performed by a forensic accounting firm, documenting every dollar Michael had stolen over 15 years. According to this analysis, you've diverted approximately $4.7 million from our partnership through secret accounts, direct client payments, and fraudulent billing practices. That's money that should have been split equally between us, according to our partnership agreement. Michael finally looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before: genuine fear. What do you want? What I want, I said, standing up and walking to the chart that showed our revenue history, is for you to understand exactly what you've done and exactly what's going to happen next. I pointed to the blue sections representing my creative work. For 30 years, my campaigns generated the vast majority of this company's revenue. My ideas, my strategies, my relationships with clients built Whitestone Marketing into the success it became. Then I pointed to the red sections representing his secret dealings. For 15 years, you systematically stole credit for my work, undermined my reputation, and diverted millions of dollars that belonged to our partnership. Michael was staring at the chart with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been caught in a lie so comprehensive that there was no way to explain it away. You thought you were playing a long game, I continued, slowly positioning yourself to take over everywhere I'd built while making me feel like I was paranoid for noticing the patterns. I walked back to my chair and sat down, looking directly into his eyes. But I was playing an even longer game, Michael. I spent 15 years documenting every betrayal, every stolen dollar, every lie you told about my contributions to this company. What happens now? He asked quietly. I smiled, not the warm smile I'd been giving him for years while he plotted against me, but the cold smile of someone who'd just achieved the most satisfying victory of their career. Now, Michael, you're going to learn why it's dangerous to underestimate a 60-year-old woman who spent 3 decades building something you thought you could steal. The real lesson was just beginning. Here's what's going to happen, I said, pulling out a fresh set of documents from my briefcase, documents that Michael definitely hadn't been expecting. You have 2 choices, and you need to make your decision right now. Michael looked like a man who'd just discovered he'd been playing poker against someone who'd been watching him cheat for 15 years. What choices? Choice number 1, I said, setting the first document in front of him, is the criminal route. I take all of this evidence, the financial records, the recorded conversations, the proof of embezzlement and fraud, directly to the district attorney's office. You spend the next 5 to 10 years in federal prison for corporate fraud, and I rebuild this company without the dead weight of a partner who's been stealing from me for half our relationship. Michael stared at the document, which was a formal complaint I'd already prepared for the prosecutor's office, complete with exhibits and a detailed timeline of his criminal activity. Choice number 2, I continued, placing a different set of papers beside the first, is the civil route. You sign these documents, which accomplish several things that will allow you to avoid prison while making this situation right. I walked him through the civil settlement I'd prepared with Patricia's help. It was comprehensive, brutal, and absolutely fair given what he'd stolen from me over the years. First, you will immediately transfer your 50% ownership stake in Whitestone Marketing to me, making me the sole owner of the company I actually built. Michael's mouth fell open. Betty? That's everything I've worked for. Everything you've worked for. I laughed. Actually laughed at the audacity of that statement. Michael, according to the forensic analysis, you've contributed approximately 15% of our company's creative output and generated less than 20% of our revenue. What you've worked for is the right to steal credit for my success while secretly planning to push me out. I continued reading from the settlement terms. Second, you will repay the $4.7 million you've embezzled from our partnership, plus interest and penalties, for a total of, I don't have that kind of money, Michael protested. Actually, you do. The forensic accountants tracked exactly where that money went. Some of it's in your personal investment accounts. Some of it went toward the down payment on that vacation home in Aspen you bought last year. Some of it's been sitting in the business account for Stone Marketing Group, waiting to fund your new venture. I pulled out another document showing Michael's complete financial picture. something else I'd been investigating for years. Between your personal assets, your secret business accounts, and the money you'll get from selling that vacation home you bought with stolen funds, you can cover the $6.2 million without filing for bankruptcy. Michael was staring at the papers like they contained his death warrant. And if you refuse the civil settlement, I file criminal charges this afternoon. The FBI has a white-collar crime unit that specializes in corporate fraud, and they're very interested in cases involving stolen intellectual property and embezzled funds. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. I should mention that I've already provided copies of all this evidence to our clients, our employees, and our industry contact. Everyone now knows exactly who was responsible for the creative work that made Whitestone Marketing successful, and everyone knows what you've been doing behind the scenes. Michael looked up sharply. You told our clients. I told them the truth, Michael. I sent each of them a detailed report showing which campaigns were actually my work, which meetings I was excluded from, and how you systematically tried to erase my contributions to their success. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen, which displayed dozens of text messages and emails from clients. They're not happy with you, Michael. In fact, 3 of our biggest clients have already terminated their contracts with Whitestone Marketing and signed new agreements with me personally. This was the part of my plan that I was most proud of. For the past 5 years, while Michael had been preparing to steal our clients, I'd been quietly building direct relationships with the people who actually valued my work. When the truth came out, they didn't hesitate to choose me over the man who'd been lying to them about his role in their success. You can't do that, Michael said desperately. Those are company clients. They're bound by non-compete agreements. Non-compete agreements that you violated when you started secretly negotiating to steal them for Stone Marketing Group. I showed him copies of his own emails, discussing client acquisition strategy for his planned new company. You can't claim exclusive rights to relationships you were already planning to steal. For the next hour, I methodically dismantled every argument Michael tried to make for why he deserved anything other than complete disgrace and financial ruin. Every defense he offered, I countered with documented evidence of his betrayal. Every claim he made about his contributions to our success, I refuted with proof of whose work had actually generated our revenue. But the most satisfying moment came when Michael finally realized that his 30-year plan to steal my life's work had not only failed, it had actually strengthened my position beyond what I could have achieved on my own. The irony, Michael, is that by forcing me to document everything so carefully, you've actually made me a much better businesswoman. I now have detailed records of every successful campaign I've ever created, complete analysis of which strategies work best with different types of clients, and comprehensive financial data about the real profitability of our various services. I gestured toward the evidence surrounding us. When I rebuild this company without you, I'll be starting from a position of knowledge and documentation that most business owners never achieve. You've accidentally given me the most valuable business intelligence package in the history of marketing consulting. Michael was staring at the table, probably trying to calculate how completely his plan had backfired. So what's it going to be? I asked. Prison and public disgrace, or civil settle, and the chance to rebuild your career with the 15% of our success that actually belonged to your legitimate work. Michael reached for the settlement documents with a shaking hand. If I sign this, what happens to my reputation in the industry? Your reputation is already destroyed, Michael. The question is whether you want to add convicted felon to corporate embezzler on your professional resume. He signed the papers. 3 months later, I was sitting in the beautifully renovated offices of Whitestone Creative, the new name for my company, reflecting both its history and its future as my sole proprietorship. The space looked completely different without Michael's presence, brighter and more creative, filled with the energy of employees who were excited to be working for someone who actually valued their contributions. My assistant knocked on the door. Betty, there's someone here to see you. Says he's a reporter from Marketing Week magazine? I smiled, recognizing the name. Marketing Week was the most prestigious publication in our industry, and they'd been wanting to interview me ever since the story of Michael's betrayal had become the talk of the marketing world. Send him in, I said. I have quite a story to tell. The reporter was a young man in his 30s, probably someone who'd heard about my case and wanted to understand how a 60-year-old woman had outsmarted a 30-year corporate con game. Mrs. White, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. The industry is fascinated by how you uncovered and documented such extensive corporate fraud. What advice would you give to other business owners who might be facing similar betrayals? I thought about his question for a moment, considering everything I'd learned during my 15-year investigation. The most important lesson, I said finally, is to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if patterns don't make sense, if someone is trying to make you feel paranoid for asking questions, those are signals that deserve investigation, not dismissal. I gestured around my office, filled with awards from grateful clients and evidence of the successful campaigns I was now properly credited with creating. Age and experience are advantages in business, not liabilities. When someone tries to convince you that you're too old, too out of touch, or too set in your ways to understand modern business, they're usually trying to distract you from the fact that your experience makes you capable of seeing through their deceptions. The reporter scribbled notes frantically. What would you say to women who are facing age discrimination in their careers? I'd say that age discrimination often comes from people who are threatened by your experience and expertise. The 60-year-old woman who's built something significant is much more dangerous to a mediocre man's ambitions than the 30-year-old woman who doesn't yet know what she's capable of achieving. As the interview continued, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gift that Michael's betrayal had given me. By forcing me to fight for what I'd built, he'd made me stronger, smarter, and more successful than I would have been if he'd remained the loyal partner I'd once believed him to be. Whitestone Creative was now generating 40% more revenue than Whitestone Marketing had at its peak, and I was working with clients who valued my experience rather than seeing it as something to overcome. The company I'd built from my investigation and recovery was better than anything Michael and I had created together. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering who your real enemies are and learning that you're strong enough to defeat them. 1 year after Michael signed the settlement documents, I was standing in front of a packed auditorium at the National Marketing Association's annual conference, delivering a keynote speech titled Age, Experience, and the Art of Corporate Survival. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated for the same expertise that Michael had tried to convince our clients I was too old to possess. How many of you, I began, looking out at an audience of marketing professionals, ranging from recent graduates to industry veterans, have ever been told you're too experienced for a job, too set in your ways to adapt to new trends, or too old to understand what younger consumers want? Nearly half the hands in the room went up, and I could see the recognition in their faces. They'd all experienced some version of the age discrimination that Michael had tried to use against me. Today, I want to tell you about the most successful business turnaround of my career, the one where I discovered that being underestimated because of your age is actually the greatest competitive advantage you can have. For the next 45 minutes, I walked the audience through the strategic advantages of experience in detecting corporate fraud, building sustainable client relationships, and creating long-term business value. I didn't go into the specific details of Michael's betrayal. That would have been unprofessional, but I talked about how 30 years in business had taught me to recognize patterns that younger professionals might miss. Experience, I told them, isn't about being stuck in old ways of doing things. Experience is about having seen enough cycles, enough failures, and enough successes to recognize when something isn't quite right. After the speech, I was approached by dozens of audience members who wanted to share their own stories of workplace age discrimination, corporate betrayal, and successful comebacks. But the conversation that stood out most was with a woman named Sarah Chen, a 55-year-old executive who'd recently discovered that her business partner was planning to force her out of their consulting firm. I have all the same instincts you described, Sarah told me as we talked over coffee in the conference center lobby. I know something's wrong. I can see the patterns, but I don't know how to prove it or what to do about it. I handed her my business card. Sarah, one of the unexpected benefits of my experience with Michael is that I now have a very clear roadmap for investigating and documenting corporate betrayal. If you're serious about fighting back, I'd be happy to help you avoid some of the mistakes I made in my early investigation." That conversation led to what would become the most rewarding part of my post-Michael career: consulting for professionals who were facing age discrimination, corporate fraud, or partnership betrayals. Within 6 months, I'd helped 8 different executives uncover and document systematic attempts to undermine their positions, steal their work, or force them into early retirement. But it wasn't just individual consulting that grew out of my experience. The publicity from Michael's case had attracted attention from several industry organizations that were concerned about age discrimination in marketing and advertising. They asked me to develop training programs to help companies recognize and address age bias in their hiring, promotion, and partnership decisions. "The data is clear," I told a group of HR executives during one of these training sessions. "Companies that embrace age diversity and experience consistently outperform those that prioritize youth over expertise. But many organizations don't realize how much institutional age discrimination is costing them in lost talent and inferior decision-making." I showed them statistics about the marketing campaigns that had performed best over the past decade, campaigns that were disproportionately created by professionals over 50 who had the experience to understand long-term brand building and consumer psychology in ways that younger marketers often missed. When you dismiss someone's contributions because of their age, you're not just losing their current capabilities. You're losing decades of accumulated knowledge about what works, what doesn't, and why certain strategies succeed while others fail. The training programs led to speaking engagements, which led to consulting contracts with Fortune 500 companies that wanted to audit their own practices for age discrimination and corporate fraud. I found myself busier at 61 than I'd ever been at 30, working with organizations that valued exactly the kind of experience that Michael had tried to convince me was a liability. But the most significant development came 18 months after Michael's defeat, when I received a call from Amanda Rodriguez, producer at 60 Minutes, who'd heard about my case through the business community. "Mrs. White, we're developing a segment about corporate fraud targeting experienced professionals, particularly women in senior positions. Your case represents a pattern we're seeing across multiple industries: established professionals being systematically undermined by partners or colleagues who want to steal credit for their work." The 60 Minutes interview aired 6 months later, and the response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of letters, emails, and phone calls from viewers who'd recognized their own situations in my story: business executives, attorneys, doctors, engineers, and other professionals who'd been made to feel like their age was a liability rather than an asset. Many of them had been gaslit by colleagues who told them they were being paranoid or oversensitive when they noticed patterns of discrimination or betrayal. Others had been pressured to retire early or accept diminished roles in companies they'd helped build. Some had discovered financial irregularities or stolen intellectual property, but didn't know how to prove their suspicions. I started receiving so many requests for help that I had to hire additional staff and expand Whitestone Creative's services, include what I called corporate justice consulting, investigations, and documentation services for professionals who suspected they were being victimized by age discrimination or partnership fraud. 3 years after my confrontation with Michael, I was running the most successful marketing consultancy on the West Coast, with a secondary practice that had helped recover over $50 million in stolen assets and lost opportunities for professionals who'd been systematically undermined by their colleagues. The greatest satisfaction, though, came from the follow-up reports I received about Michael's attempts to rebuild his career. Stone Marketing Group had collapsed within 6 months of our settlement. When potential clients learned about his history of fraud and betrayal, he tried to launch 2 other ventures, but his reputation in the industry was so damaged that he couldn't attract either clients or investors. Last I heard, Michael was working as a mid-level marketing manager for a small firm in Phoenix, making less in a year than I now made in a month. He'd gone from being my partner in a multi-million-dollar company to being a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of trying to steal credit for other people's work. But more importantly, his downfall had become a teaching tool that I used in my consulting practice. When clients worried about confronting powerful colleagues or partners who were undermining them, I would tell them about Michael's 30-year plan and how completely it had backfired. The people who try to steal your work, diminish your contributions, or force you out because of your age are counting on you to be intimidated by their apparent power, I would tell them. What they don't realize is that experience gives you patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to play a longer game than they can imagine. 5 years after Michael signed those settlement documents, I was standing in my office, looking out at the Seattle skyline, reflecting on how completely my professional life had been transformed by what I initially thought was the worst betrayal I'd ever experienced. Whitestone Creative now employed 42 people and generated over $15 million in annual revenue. My corporate justice consulting practice had helped more than 200 professionals recover stolen assets, document age discrimination, and fight back against corporate fraud. I'd been featured in Harvard Business Review, given the keynote address at 3 major industry conferences, and been asked to serve on the boards of 2 organizations dedicated to combating workplace age discrimination. But the achievement I was most proud of was sitting on my desk in the form of a bound manuscript, The Long Game: How Experience Beats Youth in Corporate Warfare, my book about recognizing, documenting, and defeating professional betrayal. The book had grown out of the countless conversations I'd had with professionals who'd found themselves in similar situations to mine. Talented, experienced people who'd been systematically undermined by colleagues who saw their age as an opportunity rather than recognizing their expertise as a threat. My editor at the publishing house had initially been skeptical about the market for a book about corporate warfare written by a 65-year-old woman. "Are you sure there's an audience for this?" she'd asked during our first meeting. 6 months later, when pre-orders hit 50,000 copies, and I was already being booked for television interviews, she called to apologize for her initial reaction. "I think I made exactly the same mistake that your business partner made," she admitted. "I underestimated what someone with your experience could accomplish." The book tour that followed was unlike anything I'd expected. At every event, I was approached by readers who wanted to share their own stories of workplace betrayal, age discrimination, and successful comeback. The common thread in all these conversations was how isolated they'd felt during their struggles, how much they'd been made to doubt their own perceptions, and how validating it was to read about someone else who'd faced similar challenges and won. But the most meaningful encounter came during a book signing in Chicago, when a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. White, my grandmother gave me your book. She's been dealing with age discrimination at her law firm for 3 years, and reading your story gave her the courage to start documenting what was happening to her." The woman handed me a copy of the book to sign. "She wanted me to tell you that you made her realize that being 73 doesn't mean being powerless. She's 60 years old again when she talks about the case she's building against her partners." That's when I realized the most important impact of my battle with Michael wasn't the money I'd recovered, business I'd rebuilt, or even the recognition I'd received. It was the example I'd set for other professionals who were being told their experience was a liability rather than an asset. Later that year, I received a call that would define the final chapter of my career. The dean of the University of Washington Business School wanted to know if I'd be interested in teaching a graduate course on corporate ethics and professional survival. "We have students who are brilliant at strategy, marketing, and finance," Dean Martinez explained, "but they're naive about the political realities of corporate life. They need to learn how to recognize and defend against the kinds of betrayal you experienced." The course I developed, Strategic Defense in Professional Relationships, became one of the most popular electives in the business school's curriculum. Every semester, I taught a new group of graduate students how to document their contributions, recognize warning signs of partnership fraud, and build the kind of evidence files that could protect them from colleagues who might try to steal credit for their work. But more than the tactical skills, I tried to teach them about the strategic value of experience and the importance of long-term thinking in professional relationships. "The people who will try to undermine you in your careers," I told each new class, "are usually thinking in terms of quarters and fiscal years. They want immediate results, quick victories, and fast advancement. But sustainable success comes from thinking in decades, from building relationships that last, and from creating value that compounds over time." I would show them the chart that had so effectively demonstrated Michael's betrayal, the visual representation of 30 years of creative work that he'd tried to claim as his own. This is what 30 years of consistent, high-quality work looks like, I'd tell them. And this is why experience is actually the most powerful weapon you can develop in business. You can't fake 3 decades of successful campaigns. You can't pretend to have relationships that took years to build. You can't manufacture the kind of reputation that comes from consistently delivering results over time. The students, most of them in their 20s and early 30s, would initially look skeptical about the value of long-term thinking in a fast-paced business environment. But by the end of the semester, after working through case studies of various corporate betrayals and their resolutions, they understood that patience and documentation were often more powerful than ambition and aggression. One student, a particularly bright young woman named Jennifer Park, stayed after class one day to ask a question that crystallized everything I'd been trying to teach. "Professor White, what if someone like Michael had succeeded? What if you hadn't been as prepared, or if you trusted him too much to gather evidence? What happens to people who don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back?" It was exactly the right question, and it led to the most important project of my post-Michael career, the Whitestone Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal and investigative services to professionals who were facing corporate fraud or age discrimination, but couldn't afford to hire private attorneys and forensic accountants. The foundation, which I established using a portion of the settlement money I'd recovered from Michael, had helped over 500 professionals document and recover from various forms of workplace betrayal. We provided everything from basic guidance on evidence collection to full legal representation for complex corporate fraud cases. But beyond the individual cases, the foundation had started to change the conversation about age and experience in business. Companies that knew we were monitoring industry practices for discriminatory patterns were more careful about how they treated older employees. Business schools were incorporating age diversity into their ethics curricula. Professional organizations were developing guidelines for recognizing and preventing the kind of systematic undermining that Michael had practiced. On my 70th birthday, I received a letter that made all the battles, all the documentation, and all the years of patient investigation worthwhile. It was from Michael. "Betty," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I aren't saying if you don't want to hear from me, but I've been watching what you've built since our partnership ended, and I needed to tell you something. I spent 30 years thinking that business success came from positioning yourself ahead of other people, from taking credit where you could get it, and from convincing people that experience was a limitation rather than an asset. I thought I was smarter than you because I was willing to lie and steal while you were focused on doing good work. What I didn't understand was that you were playing a completely different game than I was. While I was trying to win individual battles through deception and manipulation, you were building something that would last. You were creating real value, developing genuine expertise, and establishing the kind of reputation that can't be faked or stolen. I will never forgive myself for what I tried to do to you, but I want you to know that watching you recover and succeed beyond anything we accomplished together has taught me more about business strategy than 30 years of trying to game the system. You were right, and I was wrong. Experience and integrity are more powerful than ambition and deception. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." I never replied to Michael's letter, but I kept it in my desk drawer as a reminder of why the work I was doing mattered, not just for the individual professionals I'd helped recover from betrayal, but for the larger principle that experience, patience, and ethical behavior were still the most reliable paths to lasting success. At 70 years old, I was busier and more fulfilled than I'd ever been. Whitestone Creative continued to grow. The corporate justice consulting practice was expanding internationally. The foundation was helping hundreds of professionals each year, and my book was being translated into 12 languages. But more than any individual achievement, I was proud of the example I'd set for professionals who were being told their age made them expendable. I'd proven that experience is not a limitation, but a weapon. That patience is not passivity, but strategy. and that the person who underestimates a 70-year-old woman with 30 years of documented success is making the biggest mistake of their career. The final lesson I taught in every class, every consulting session, and every speaking engagement was the simplest and most important. Never let anyone convince you that your experience is a weakness. The person who's seen the most, learned the most, and survived the most is usually the most dangerous opponent in any conflict. Michael had spent 30 years learning that lesson the hard way, and thanks to the foundation, the book, the courses, and the consulting practice that grew from his betrayal, thousands of other professionals would never have to learn it the same way. This story isn't just about one woman's fight against one dishonest business partner. It's about recognizing that experience is power, that documentation is defense, and that the most dangerous person in any professional conflict is often the one everyone assumes is past their prime. If you're facing age discrimination, if someone's trying to steal credit for your work, if you suspect a colleague is undermining you systematically, remember this: you have tools they don't expect, patience they can't match, and knowledge they can't fake. Age is not a limitation, it's a strategic advantage. And anyone who underestimates what a determined professional with decades of experience can accomplish is about to learn a very expensive lesson. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Betty White, reminding you that the best revenge is building something they could never steal, and the most satisfying victory is the one that took years to plan. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because wisdom doesn't shout, it documents everything and strikes when the evidence is perfect.